The time is precisely 1:15 p.m. This is the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation. News edited by Romesh Piris and read by Chandima Virakon. Headlines. The President emphasizes prioritizing convenience of students when conducting exams. The State Minister of Defence says there is no room for architects of religious disharmony. Under the President's initiative to digitize public services, an online passport application system to be initiated. The Cabinet grants approval to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission by including provisions in the South African model. Cabinet approval granted to revive the suspended Colombo LRT project. 6 Sri Lankans and victims of human trafficking repatriated from Myanmar. On international news, Ukraine-Russia border demilitarized zone floated for peace deal. And in sports news, it's French Open 2023. Novak Djokovic beats Alexander Kovacevic and Carlos Alcaraz also through. Local stories in detail. President Ranil Wickremesinghe at a recent discussion expressed his concerns about the obstacles faced by students when taking exams in unfamiliar environments. He emphasized the need for the Ministry of Education and the Examinations Department to prioritize the convenience and progress of students over their own convenience. Recognizing the difficulties faced by students, the President advised the education authorities to transform schools with a minimum of 75 qualified students into examination centers, provided that it doesn't disrupt ongoing exam activities. He instructed officials to take prompt action in implementing this plan. During the discussion, it was revealed that the 2023 GCE Ordinary Level Examination, which began yesterday, would be conducted at 3,568 centres, accommodating a total of 472,553 students. The government has employed approximately 40,000 officials for the smooth execution of the exams. However, President Wickremesinghe received reports from concerned parents and students regarding the inconvenience caused by redirecting students from their own schools to other examination centres. Understanding the impact this has on students' mental well-being, the President stressed the importance of informing schools and students about such changes at least 1 year in advance. State Minister of Defence Premitha Bandara Tennakon says there is no room for architects of religious disharmony. He said strict law enforcement in accordance with Constitution and Penal Code will be enforced if a person or an organized group is trying to whip up communal sentiments or work with a similar motive. He noted that there are obvious signs that another crisis is being triggered in the country once again, especially at a crucial time when the country is on a path of recovery from a severe economic crisis that was acutely experienced in recent times. While raising concerns into the various elements with vested interests eyeing to disrupt the prevailing peaceful situation by igniting religious disputes in the country, the State Minister emphasized the importance of maintaining religious stability for a healthy society. Furthermore, he stressed that the government will not hesitate to strictly enforce the law in accordance with the Chapter 9 of the Constitution and Penal Code 291 against such acts. The Cabinet of Ministers has granted approval to the proposal to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission by including provisions in the South African model. The combined cabinet paper was presented by the Minister of Justice, Prison Affairs and Constitutional Reforms and the Minister of Foreign Affairs for the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Mechanism in Sri Lanka, taking into account the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Cabinet spokesman Minister Bandulu Gunawardena said the Minister of Justice, Prison Affairs and Constitutional Reforms and the Minister of Foreign Affairs visited South Africa at the invitation of the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa in order to conduct a preliminary study on South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Accordingly, based on the information received during the visit of South Africa, both ministers have proposed to initiate a Truth and Reconciliation Mechanism, which received the approval of the Cabinet. This news comes from the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation. Continuing with the local stories, the Cabinet of Ministers has given the go-ahead to resume the Colombo Light Rail Transit or the LRT project, which was to be jointly implemented with the support of the Japanese government, but scrapped during the administration of the former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Cabinet spokesperson Minister Bandulu Gunawardena stated this while addressing the media briefing convened to announce Cabinet decisions this morning. The Cabinet spokesperson explained the decision to resume the LRT project was taken prior to President Ranil Wickremesinghe's official visit to Japan last week in a bid to restore Sri Lanka's credibility with the international community. According to Minister Gunawardena, the President had secured the approval of the Cabinet of Ministers to resume the Colombo LRT project before departing for Tokyo. 6 Sri Lankans who were victims of human trafficking and stranded in Myanmar have been repatriated. Following interventions made by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the group, rescued by Myanmar authorities, was handed over to the Sri Lankan Embassy in Yangon for repatriation. The Lankans were identified as victims of an organized trafficking ring operating in Southeast Asian countries. Accordingly, they were safely repatriated to Sri Lanka via Bangkok with the assistance of the International Organization for Migration and the Aid Myanmar Foundation. To conclude the local news, the headlines again. The President emphasizes prioritizing convenience of students when conducting exams. The State Minister of Defence says there is no room for architects of religious disharmony. Under the President's initiative to digitize public services, an online passport application system to be initiated. The Cabinet grants approval to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission by including provisions in the South African model. Cabinet approval granted to revive the suspended Colombo LRT project. 6 Sri Lankans and victims of human trafficking repatriated from Myanmar. That concludes the local news for now.
The main news story is brought to you by Siddhalepa Vedamahatmya.
And on the main news story, the Immigration and Immigration Controller General Harsha Ilukpitiya announced that President Ranil Wickremesinghe's initiative to digitize public services includes the implementation of an online passport application system in the coming days. This new process aims to streamline the passport application process and ensure that passports are delivered to applicants' residences within a span of 3 days. The Immigration and Immigration Controller made these comments taking part in a program produced by the Presidential Media Division, and he highlighted the development of this procedure and its wide availability. That ends the main news story.
The main news story was brought to you by Siddhalepa Vedamahatmya.
We move on to Watchlight. The Examinations Department called for applications for marking examiners for the 2022-2023 GCE Ordinary Level Examinations. Applications for marking the GCE Ordinary Level Examination commenced on Monday and will conclude on the 15th of June. The Commissioner General of Examinations, HJMC Amit Jayasundara, requested examiners to support the program, considering it as a national task. Accordingly, the examiners were advised to log on to www.onlineexams.gov.lk to apply. The email, once again, www.onlineexams.gov.lk. That concludes Watchlight. And on to the world news, the headlines. Ukraine-Russia border demilitarized zone floated for peace deal. Lula welcomes back banned Venezuelan leader Maduro. China sends first civilian astronaut to space. Ukraine's presidential office has said a demilitarized zone between 100 and 120 kilometers wide should be established in Russian border territory with Ukraine as part of any post-war settlement. Mikhailo Podolyak, the advisor to the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, said the demilitarized zone should cover the Russian regions of Belgorod, Bryansk, Kursk and Rostov in order to protect adjacent territories in Ukraine. Podolyak said such a zone, which cannot be used for occupied by military forces, would likely require a mandatory international control contingent at the first stage. The presidential advisor further emphasized that a demilitarized zone should be a key topic of a post-war settlement, adding that such a buffer would prevent the recurrence of aggression in the future. Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro has visited Brazil for the first time since he was banned by former far-right President Jair Bolsonaro in 2019. Mr. Maduro was received by the new president, fellow leftist Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, ahead of a summit of Latin American leaders in Brasilia. A number of countries questioned the legitimacy of Mr. Maduro, who is described by opponents as a dictator. Greeting his guest in the Brazilian capital on Monday, Lula said his own return had come 5 months earlier, referring to the time when he again assumed power after beating Mr. Bolsonaro in tight presidential elections. China sent its first civilian astronaut to orbit earlier today, as it launched the Shenzhou 16 mission to its space station for its second in-orbit crew rotation, marking another step forward for the country's ambitious space program. The 3 Shenzhou 16 astronauts blasted off from the Jingquan Satellite Launch Center in the desert of China's Gansu province at 9:31 a.m. local time, headed for the Tiangong space station orbiting Earth. It is China's 5th manned mission into the space station since 2021. In its press conference Monday, the CMSA also reiterated China's plan for a manned lunar landing by 2030. Back to the world headlines. Ukraine-Russia border demilitarized zone floated for peace deal. Lula welcomes back banned Venezuelan leader Maduro. China sends first civilian astronaut to space. That ends the world news.
Development news.
And on the development news, Sri Lanka's Coast Conservation and Coastal Resource Management Department has cleared a proposal to build water villas in 16 islets off Kalpitia in the northwestern coast. State Minister for Investment Promotion Dilum Amunugama announced that although proposals for the project were received earlier, approval was not received from the Coast Conservation and Coastal Resource Management Department. Accordingly, the approval has been granted to build water villas in 16 islets and to develop 15 other locations for tourism and leisure purposes. In 2021, Sun Resort Investment Lanka Private Limited won the bid to set up water villas on 3 islets in Kalpitia, which are already leased by the firm. Sri Lanka Tourism Development Authority has already acquired 12 water villa development. That ends the development news. And on sports news, Novak Djokovic began his campaign for a record 23rd men's Grand Slam singles title with victory, while world number 1 Carlos Alcaraz also progressed to the second round at Roland Garros. Serbia's Djokovic, a 2-time champion in Paris, claimed a 6-3, 6-2, 7-2, 6, 7-1 win over Alexander Kovacevic. US Open champion Alcaraz also came through in straight sets, beating Italian Flavio Cobolli 6-0, 6-2, 7-5. The two are in the same half of the draw and could meet in the semi-finals. That ends sports news.
Go ekatiyana youth ekat life ekේ change ekat niyamata set wenna as wahagena dakapu hina habe karanna youth ekat niyamata set wenna friendship එක menna.
The all-new NSB Ithru Mithru account, NSB IAM, a plan for your dream.
Business News, sponsored by National Savings Bank, the safest place for your money.
Taking a look at business news, reaffirming its commitment to fostering financial literacy among students, Sri Lanka's leading private sector bank, HNB plc, announced the reopening of its student savings unit at St. Joseph's College, Colombo. The reopening comes as part of the bank's continued efforts to instill the habit of saving among young minds. Celebrating the reopening of the Student Savings Unit at St. Joseph's College, the unit aims to empower students with a deeper understanding of saving and the value of living within their means. By developing this essential life skill, students will be well prepared to fund their higher education and make other important investments in the future. That was the business news.
Business News, sponsored by National Savings Bank, the safest place for your money.
Go එකක් තියන youth එකට life එකේ change එකට නියමෙට set වෙන්න ඇස් වහගෙන දැකපු හින හැබැයි කරන්න youth එකට නියමෙට set වෙන friendship එක මෙන්න.
The all-new NSB Ithru account, NSB IAM, a plan for your dream.
And on economic news, the acting ambassador for Japan in Sri Lanka, Kotaro Katsuki, congratulated Sri Lanka obtaining the approval of the IMF Executive Board in March for its extended fund facility. Kotaro Katsuki said that this major step is most welcome, which has helped towards the revitalization of the Sri Lankan economy. He made these comments at the inauguration of the Build Sri Lanka Housing and Construction International Expo 2023, organized by the Chamber of Construction Industry of Sri Lanka, that concluded at BMICH on Sunday. The annual exhibition showcased products and services in the housing and construction sector, held for the 18th consecutive occasion. That came to you in economic news.
Weather report.
And finally, we take a look at the weather report. The Department of Meteorology predicts showers or thunder showers at times in the western and Sabaragamu provinces and in the Galle and the Matra districts. The Met Department added that showers or thunder showers can be expected at several places in the central, Uva and eastern provinces and in the Polonnaru district during the evening or at night. Fairly heavy showers above 50 mm are likely at some places in the eastern and Uva provinces. Meanwhile, the general public has been requested to take adequate precautions to minimize damage caused by temporary localized strong winds and lightning during thunder showers. That was the weather report. And to conclude this bulletin of news, the headlines again. The President emphasizes prioritizing convenience of students when conducting exams. The State Minister of Defence says there is no room for architects of religious disharmony. Under the President's initiative to digitize public services, an online passport application system to be initiated. The Cabinet grants approval to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission by including provisions in the South African model. Cabinet approval granted to revive the suspended Colombo LRT project. 6 Sri Lankans and victims of human trafficking repatriated from Myanmar. On news overseas, Ukraine-Russia border demilitarized zone floated for peace deal. And in sports news, French Open 2023, Novak Djokovic beats Alexander Kovacevic and Carlos Alcaraz also through. With that, we conclude this bulletin of news from the Sri Lanka Broadcasting Corporation.